from grade 6 and I'm going to be reading you the last 2 chapters of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. I hope you enjoy. Chapter 29. The other children go home. "We must go down and take a look at our little friends before we do anything else," said Mr. Wonka. He pressed a different button and the lift dropped lower, and soon it was hovering just above the entrance gates of the factory. Looking down now, Charlie could see the children and their parents standing in a little group just inside the gates. "I can only see 3, he said. "Who's missing?" "I expect it's Mike Teeve," Mr. Wonka said, "but he'll be coming along soon. Do you see the trucks?" Mr. Wonka pointed to a line of gigantic covered vans parked in a line nearby. "Yes," Charlie said. "What are they for?" "Don't you remember what it said on the golden tickets? Every child goes home with a lifetime supply of sweets. There's one truck hold for each of them, loaded to the brim." "Aha!" Mr. Wonka went on. "There goes our friend Augustus Gloop. Did you see him? He's getting into the first truck with his mother and father." "You mean he's really all right?" asked Charlie, astonished. "Even after going up that awful pipe, he's very much all right," said Mr. Wonka. "He's changed," said Grandpa Joe, peering down through the glass wall of the elevator. "He used to be fat. Now he's as thin as a straw." "Of course he changed," said Mr. Wonka, laughing. "He got squeezed in the pipe. Don't you remember? And look, there goes Miss Violet Birumagade, the great gum chewer. It seems as though they had managed to de-juice her after all. I'm so glad. And how healthy she looks. Much better than before." "She's purple in the face," cried Grandpa Joe. "So she is," said Mr. Wonka. Well, there's nothing we can do about that." "Good gracious," cried Charlie. "Look at poor Veronica Salt and Mr. Salt. They're simply covered with rubbish." "And here comes Mike Teeve," said Grandpa Joe. "Good heavens, what have they done to him? He's about 10 feet tall and as thin as a wire." "They've overstretched him on the gum stretching machine," said Mr. Wonka. "How very careless." But dreadful for him," cried Charlie. "Nonsense," said Mr. Wonka. "He's very lucky. Every basketball team in the country will be trying to get him. But now," he added, "it's time we leave these silly 4 children behind. I have something very important to talk to you about, my dear Charlie." Mr. Wonka pressed another button, and the lift swung upwards into the sky. Chapter 30. Charlie's Chocolate Factory. The great gas lift was now hovering high over the town. Inside the lift stood Mr. Wonka, Grandpa Joe, and little Charlie. How I love my chocolate factory," said Mr. Wonka, gazing down. Then he paused, and he turned around and looked at Charlie with the most serious expression on his face. "Do you love it too, Charlie?" he asked. "Oh, yes," cried Charlie. "I think it's the most wonderful place in the world." "I'm very pleased to hear you say that," said Mr. Wonka, looking more serious than ever. He went on staring at Charlie. "Yes," he said, "I'm very pleased to hear that. And now I shall tell you why." Mr. Wonka cocked his head to one side, and all at once tiny twinkling wrinkles of a smile appeared around the corners of his eyes. And he said, "You see, my dear boy, I have decided to make you a present of the whole place. As soon as you are old enough to run it, the entire factory will become yours." Charlie stared at Mr. Wonka. Grandpa Joe opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. "It's quite true," Mr. Wonka said, smiling broadly. "Now, I'm really giving it to you. That's all right, isn't it?" "Giving it to him?" gasped Grandpa Joe. You must be joking. I'm not joking, sir. I'm deadly serious. But why should you want to give your factory to little Charlie? Listen, Mr. Wonka said. I'm an old man. I'm much older than you think. I can't go forever. I've got no children of my own, no family at all. So who's gonna run the factory when I get too old to do it myself? Someone's gotta keep going, if only for the sake of the Oompa Loompas. Mind you, there are thousands of clever men who would give anything for the chance to come and take over for me. But I don't want that sort of person. I don't want a grown-up person at all. A grown-up won't listen to me. He won't learn. He will try to do the things in his own way and not mine. So I have to have a child. I want a good, sensible, loving child, one whom I can tell my most precious, sweet-making secrets while I'm still alive. So that's why you sent out the golden tickets, cried Charlie. Exactly, said Mr. Wonka. I've decided to invite 5 children to the factory, and one I like best at the end of the day would be the winner. But Mr. Wonka, stammered Grandpa Joe, do you really, truly mean you're giving the whole of this enormous factory to Charlie? After all, there's no time for arguments, cried Mr. Wonka. We must go at once and fetch the rest of the family, Charlie's father and mother, and anyone else that's around. They can all still live in the factory from now on. They can all help run it until Charlie's old enough to do it by himself. Where do you live, Charlie? Charlie peered down at the glass floor, at the snow-covered house that lay below. It's over there, he said, pointing. It's that little cottage right over there, on the edge of town. The little tiny one. I can see it, cried Mr. Wonka, and he pressed some more buttons, and the lift shot down towards Charlie's house. I'm afraid my mother won't come with us, Charlie sadly said. Why ever not? Because she won't leave Grandma Josephine and Grandma Georgina and Grandpa George. But they must come too. They can't, Charlie said. They're very old and they haven't been out of bed for 20 years. Then we'll take the bed along as well with them in it, said Mr. Wonka. There's plenty of room in the lift for a bed. You could get the bed out of the house, said Grandpa Joe. It won't go through the door. You mustn't despair, cried Mr. Wonka. Nothing is impossible. You watch. The lift was now hovering over the roof of the Bucket's little house. What are you going to do? Cried Charlie. I'm going to right on fetch them, said Mr. Wonka. How? Asked Grandpa Joe. Through the roof, said Mr. Wonka, pressing another button. No! Shouted Charlie. Stop! Shouted Grandpa Joe. Crash went the lift right down through the roof of the house into the old people's bedroom. Showers of dust, broken little tiles and bits of wood, and cockroaches and spiders and bricks and cement went raining down on the 3 old ones who were lying in bed. Each of them thought that was the end of the world was to come. Grandma Georgina fainted. Grandma Josephine dropped her false teeth. Grandpa George got put his head under the blanket, and Mr. and Mrs. Bucket came rushing from the next room. Save us, cried Grandma Josephine. Calm yourself, my darling wife, said Grandpa Joe, stepping out of the lift. It's only us. Mother, cried Charlie, rushing into Miss Bucket's arms. Mother, listen what happened. We're all going back to live in Mr. Wonka's family, and we're going to help him run it. And he's giving it all to me, and... What are you thinking about? Said Miss Bucket. Just look at our house, cried poor Mr. Bucket. It's in ruins. My dear sir, said Mr. Wonka, jumping forward and shaking Mr. Bucket warmly in the hand. I'm so very glad to meet you. You mustn't worry about your house from now on. You are never going to need it again anyway. Who's the crazy man? Screamed Grandma Josephine. He could have killed us all. This, said Grandpa Joe, this is Mr. Willy Wonka himself. It took quite a time for Grandpa Joe and Charlie to explain to everyone exactly what had been happening to them all day, and even if they all refused to ride back in the factory of the lift. I'd rather die in my bed, shouted Grandma Josephine. So would I, cried Grandma Georgina. I refuse to, announced Grandpa George. So Mr. Wonka and Grandpa George and Charlie, taking no notice of their screams, simply pushed the bed into the lift. They pushed Mr. and Mrs. Bucket after it. Then they got in themselves. Mr. Wonka pressed a button. The doors closed. Grandma Georgina screamed and the lift rose up off of the roof and shot through the sky, from the hole of the roof out into the open sky. Charlie climbed to the bed and tried to calm the three old people, who were still profound with fear. Please don't be frightened, he said. It's quite safe, and we're going to the most wonderful place in the world. Charlie's right, said Grandpa Joe. Will there be anything to eat when we get there? Asked Grandma Josephine. I'm starving. The whole family's starving. Anything to eat? Cried Charlie. Oh, you just wait and see. Thank you so much for listening to today's read along, and I hope you really enjoyed it. Have a good night. Bye.